They say your first real surgery changes you. For me, it was the moment I stopped being the girl from the system and became the woman the system would try to destroy. My name is Dr. Carolyn Bennett. I was 29 the first time I stood at the head of an operating table, completely unsupervised. The hospital smelled of iodine and burned coffee, and I could still hear the faint clink of champagne glasses from the banquet hall 2 floors below, where the senior surgeons were celebrating the chief's retirement. I was up here, elbow deep in someone else's life, holding a scalpel that felt heavier than lead. The young man on the table had arrived from a motorcycle crash, barely clinging to life. As I made the first cut, his blood pressure tanked. For a second, the world went silent, and I was no longer in the operating room. I was a little girl, screaming outside an emergency room door while a nurse whispered, "There's no surgeon on duty." We called, but he's out of town. The night my parents died, back in the OR, I clenched my teeth. "We're not losing him," I whispered. Hours later, the patient was stable. I had saved a life, but I had broken protocol to do it. The next morning, I was called into the chief's office, not for accommodation, but for a formal inquiry. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The head surgeon I'd overstepped had been drinking martinis at a party while I was saving his patient. That was the first domino. The one that would lead to me losing everything I had ever fought for. This is the story of how they took my career, my husband, and my child. But how they failed to take my fight. The first time I heard his name, it was whispered like a threat. Ryan Mercer. Room 3. Get Dr. Bennett. I remember the way the nurse's voice faltered, a subtle warning that this wasn't an ordinary patient. This was a privileged last name attached to a panicked, powerful father, the kind of situation that comes with complications that have nothing to do with medicine. I walked into the private room, and the air was thick with the smell of entitlement and fear. Ryan was slumped in a wheelchair, pale and sweating. But it took me less than 5 seconds to know this was no stomach flu. His pupils were blown, his pulse skipping like a scratched record. I'd done a rotation in addiction medicine. I knew the chemical smell in his sweat. His appendix was on the brink of rupture, but his blood work was a minefield of synthetic cannabinoids, maybe fentanyl. I knelt beside him, keeping my voice low and calm. "Ryan, I'm Dr. Bennett. I need you to tell me exactly what you took." He groaned, clutching his side. "Nothing. I swear, it just hurts." The lie was automatic, reflexive. I should have sent him straight to psych. But that's not how it works. When the last name is Mercer. Before I could even change gloves, his father, Walter Mercer, was on the phone with the chief of surgery, issuing directives, not requests. Ryan would be treated discreetly, immediately, and without press. The chief was in D.C., which left me. Dr. Corwin, the acting head, caught me in the hallway. "Carolyn," he said, his eyes avoiding mine. "Just be careful. The Mercers are major donors." It wasn't advice. It was a warning. I scrubbed in and opened the boy up within 30 minutes. It was textbook until it wasn't. The drugs in his system warred with the anesthesia. His blood pressure plummeted. His heart rate spiked. He started crashing mid-procedure. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Hayes, was a rock. "Stay with me, Bennett," she commanded, her voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. We stabilized him barely. I sutured the site, ordered full toxicology screens, and wrote down every single detail in his chart. I dictated my notes with precision, ensuring every observation, every chemical marker was recorded. I wasn't going to be the doctor who looked the other way. When I came to check on him the next morning, Walter Mercer was already there, standing over his son's bed like a man inspecting merchandise. "Why does he look like hell?" he asked, not even glancing at me. Because he's been through hell, I said, reviewing the chart. Finally, he turned his ice-cold eyes on me. In the hallway, his tone sharpened. You're making notes in his file about drugs. I documented his condition, Mr. Mercer. It was medically relevant for his anesthetic reaction. He is not an addict. He's a college student and made a mistake. He tested positive for a cocktail of substances that almost killed him on my table. You don't want to go down this path, he warned, his voice dropping to a low growl. Records can be amended, memories can be unreliable. That should have been my cue to shut up, to nod, to let it go, but I couldn't. It wasn't in my DNA. I thought of my foster parents, the ones who taught me that silence in the face of a lie is a lie itself. Your son could have died, I said, my voice steady. He needs help, not denial. His eyes narrowed. You're a surgeon, Dr. Bennett, not a social worker. Stick to your job. 5 days later, Ryan Mercer was discharged. 3 days after that, he was dead. The official cause was a post-op infection, but I knew better. And the next time my name was called down that hallway, it wasn't to save a life. It was to take mine apart. The knock on the chief's office door was 3 short, rehearsed taps. I was sitting across from Dr. Corwin when 2 men in charcoal suits stepped inside. One flipped open a badge. Dr. Carolyn Bennett, he asked. I'm Detective Harrow. We have a few questions regarding the recent Mercer case. My blood ran cold. The autopsy suggests sepsis, secondary to a post-operative infection, the assistant. D.A. Rosenthal said, opening a folder. That's not possible, I insisted. He was stable at discharge, no signs of infection. And yet, Rosenthal continued, there are discrepancies in his chart. Missing pages, no toxicology screen, no mention of substance abuse. I stared at him, my mind racing. I wrote those notes myself. I dictated them. I ordered those screens. Well, they're not in the record now. I looked at Dr. Corwin, who suddenly found the pattern on his tie intensely fascinating. That's when I understood. The chart hadn't just been misplaced. It had been surgically altered. The cover-up wasn't mine. It was theirs. A few days later, I was suspended. Then came the hearing, then the formal charges, negligence, gross misconduct. The media went wild. Doctor of Death, one headline screamed. They used the worst photo they could find, my tired eyes, the shadow under my cheekbones, a hint of blood on my collar. I became a caricature, a story, not a person. An easy scapegoat. The girl from the system who flew too close to the sun. And through it all, my husband, Elijah, was quiet, too quiet. He was the son of a prominent judge, a man whose entire life was about maintaining the family's pristine reputation. He didn't touch me at night. He spent more time on the phone with his mother than looking me in the eye. One evening, I found him on our balcony on the phone with his father. Yes, I'll talk to her about taking the deal, he was saying, his voice low. I know what this family needs. We can't have a scandal. When he came back inside, he was smiling that strained, practical smile of his. We need to be realistic, Carolyn, he said. The evidence isn't in your favor, but my father has contacts. If you accept a plea something like reckless endangerment, they can push for probation, no jail time. I stared at him, my heart a cold stone in my chest. You want me to admit guilt for something I didn't do? It's better than prison, isn't it? It's a lie. It's survival, he countered. He meant well, I told myself. He wasn't cruel, just spineless. The trial began. I stood alone. My hospital-appointed attorney looked at me like a project she didn't want. The courtroom was filled with people ready to dissect my life. And then came Elijah, called to testify. For the defense, my defense. He stepped up to the stand, a pillar of respectability in a crisp suit, and told the jury that I was a brilliant surgeon, but I was exhausted, overworked, that I might have rushed. I wasn't there, he said, his voice laced with feigned sympathy, but it's possible Carolyn made a miscalculation. She's been under a lot of pressure. A collective hush fell over the room. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had offered me up as a sacrifice to the gods of power and influence that his family worshipped. For the first time, I saw who he really was, a man who didn't stand beside me, but stood beside power. When the judge announced my sentence, 1 year probation, 5 years suspension of my license, I didn't cry. I just nodded and walked out of that courtroom, knowing I had lost everything except myself. We didn't speak on the ride home. The sentence echoed in my ears like static. 5 years without surgery, without purpose, without the only thing that ever made me feel real. Inside our apartment, I went straight to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Elijah stepped into the room holding an envelope. "You should start packing," he said softly. "I put some money in here. Enough for I. Deposit somewhere else." I didn't move. "I filed the papers this morning," he added. "The divorce will be quick. My parents already helped draft it." I finally looked up. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not trying. You're washing your hands of me." He stepped back as if I'd slapped him. A week later, I was gone. Hospitals wouldn't take me. Private practices refused to call me back. I was radioactive. Carolyn Bennett, the doctor who killed a Mercer. I crashed on couches, slept in shelters. Some nights, I would sit in the waiting room of the very hospital where I used to work, just to feel less invisible. And then the nausea started. I bought a pregnancy test with my last $20. 2 pink lines appeared in the bathroom stall of a dollar store. I was pregnant with Elijah's child. I should have felt dread, but instead, I felt a stubborn, impossible flicker of warmth. It was the cruelest timing imaginable, but that flicker, it was mine. I didn't tell Elijah. I never would. This child would be born with my name, my fight, my blood. The pregnancy was hard. I was constantly sick and exhausted from sleeping on borrowed mattresses and eating dollar menu meals. I found a tiny room to rent, a shoebox with peeling paint, and a single mattress on the floor. I took whatever jobs I could, cleaning hallways, scrubbing the floors of a pharmacy at night. Every wrinkled dollar bill went into a jar hidden in the closet for vitamins, for baby clothes, for a life I was determined to build. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was only 26 weeks along. The cramps started low, then grew sharp enough to steal my breath. By the time I made it to the free clinic, my vision was blurring. Placental abruption, I heard someone say. The last thing I remember before the darkness was the cold blue ceiling of the AO and a voice, soft but certain, "Save the baby." When I woke up, my body felt like a battlefield. I turned my head and saw the incubator. He was the size of my hand, my son. His skin like crumpled tissue paper, his limbs as thin as twigs. But his tiny chest rose and fell, a fragile rhythm in a silent world. They told me he weighed 1 pound, 7 ounces. They didn't lie to me. They said, "Dr. Bennett, the odds are slim." They didn't know I used to be one of them, that I understood every beep, every warning light, every shift in oxygen levels. Knowledge is a terrible curse when it comes to hope. Every day, I sat beside his incubator. I wasn't allowed to touch him at first, just watch, helpless. On the 4th day, a nurse slipped me a pair of sterile gloves. "Just your finger," she said. I reached inside, and he wrapped his whole world around the tip of my pinky. It was the first time since the trial, since the fall, that I felt anything close to peace. I whispered stories to him, told him how strong he was, how brave. I named him Benjamin. The 6th night he crashed, a brain bleed. His oxygen levels tanked so fast the alarm screamed. The neonatologist tried to shield me, but I pushed past her. I wanted to be with him. The machines pumped and hissed, but I only heard the silence where his breathing used to be. I slid a gloved hand into the incubator and touched his cheek. "Hi, baby," I whispered. "It's Mama, I'm here." His eyelids fluttered once, and then he was gone. They gave me a small paper envelope afterward. Inside was his hospital bracelet and the tiny knit cap he'd worn. I carried it in my coat pocket for weeks. I had stopped being a surgeon. I had stopped being a wife, and now I had stopped being a mother. I was just a woman with empty hands and a name no one wanted to say out. Loud dot after Benjamin died, the world became something I walked through like a ghost. The hospital discharged me with a grief pamphlet. I returned to my tiny room to find my things in the hallway. The rent was overdue. I was on the streets. I ended up at a shelter. I didn't tell anyone who I was. Surgeon, widow, mother, exile, those. Words had no weight there. What mattered was staying warm, staying unnoticed. But even on the streets, people get sick. One night, a woman stumbled in with a swollen, infected leg. She was burning with fever. No one knew what to do. I did. I asked for a razor blade and a bottle of vodka. I cleaned the blade, said a prayer, and lanced the infection. The next morning, her fever broke. Word spread. They started calling me Doc. It was the first time I'd been called that in months, and it meant something. I still didn't have a home. But deep beneath the numbness, something began to stir. I wasn't healed, but I was still here. And in a world that had tried to forget me, that was a kind of defiance. It was almost midnight during a blizzard when I heard it. A cry, thin and desperate, almost drowned in the storm. Under the awning of a boarded-up storefront, I found a baby. Wrapped in a thin blanket, his lips turning blue. My body reacted before my mind could. I scooped him into my arms and ran. I don't even remember which hospital I found. I just remember screaming, "He's freezing. Help." They took him from me. And for 2 days, I slept in the waiting room chairs. They started asking about foster care. I asked if I could apply. They looked at me, a homeless woman in tattered clothes. "Ma'am, do you have housing? A job?" "No," I admitted. "But I'm a doctor, or I was. I want to help." A woman from Child Protective Services, sharp and world-weary, heard my entire story about Benjamin, the trial, the streets, the way I still carried my son's cap. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "You'll have to take classes, get housing, prove stability. It'll be a process." "I'll do all of it," I said without hesitation. "Then start with this," she said. "His name's Noah." The name felt like sunlight. It became my purpose. The apartment I found was one room over a laundromat, but it had a door. That locked. I took a job as a night shift janitor at St. Vincent's, scrubbing the very floors I used to walk in scrubs. Every dollar I made, I saved. Every moment I wasn't working, I was in the foster care program. And every week I visited Noah. The first time he fell asleep in my lap, I cried so quietly I didn't even feel the tears. It was the simple, unbearable miracle of being trusted again. 6 months in, I had enough savings to renew my medical license. "You were one of the best surgeons in the city," the man at the licensing board said, looking at my file. "You could have just moved to another state." "I never left," I told him. He stamped the form. Approved. A clinic on the south side needed hands. They didn't care about gaps in resumes or scandals that weren't mine to begin with. The day I put on those gloves again, the day a patient said, "Thank you, Doc," something settled in my chest. And on the day I got the letter approving me for a permanent foster placement of Noah, I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment and laughed. Not the laugh of someone who won, but the laugh of someone who survived. It's been 5 years. We live in a small house with a garden now. Noah likes numbers and hates raisins. He calls me mom. I work at the community clinic, and once a week I volunteer at the medical college, teaching students about compassion and failure and how a single moment doesn't define a life. On the anniversary of Benjamin's birth, I light a candle, not to mourn, but to say thank you. Because even in death, he gave me a second chance. And I won't waste it. I used to think the worst thing in the world was being broken. But it turns out the worst thing is believing you'll never be whole again, because you will. Maybe not in the way you expected, but in time and in truth, you will rebuild. I did, and some stories don't end with revenge. They begin with it, so let me know in the comments. Have you ever found strength in the most unexpected places? And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe.